Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our third and final day of the conference Shnorhali of Barakayur, Saint Nersēs Shnorhali in his context. We have a full panel this morning, Nersess before and after. And we'll have three speakers on this panel, Dr. Ani Shahinian, Professor Sergio Laporta, and Professor Roberta Irving. And so let me start out by introducing Dr. Ani Shahinian, who will be our first speaker. Of course, we all know Ani through collaboration and through all the work she's done to put this conference together. She's the assistant professor in Armenian Christian art and culture and holder of the Grace and Paul Shahinian lectureship at St. Nersess Seminary here with a joint appointment at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary. She earned her doctorate in history and theology at the University of Oxford and holds an MA degree in Near Eastern languages and cultures from UCLA, where Professor Peter Cowe, and I were all together some maybe 10 years ago now. And I know, it's hard to believe. And she also has a diploma in philosophy and theology from Oxford. She received her BA in philosophy, ethics, public policy, and professional writing from UCSB, and her doctoral research addresses the question of Christian martyrdom in the context of political, economic, and ecclesiastical history in late medieval Armenia. And more broadly, her research interests address questions of what it means to be human in a technological age, focusing on virtue ethics and freedom of the human will. And her talk for this conference is entitled The Birth of the Catholicosate of Akhtamar During the Time of Nersēs Shnorhali.
Thank you, Justin. I am going to work quite laboriously, I would say, to go from my executive brain to my academic side of my brain to be able to give this talk. So please bear with me as I try to go through the presentation, really bringing it together quite last minute, but I'm really hoping that there are points in here which would become open for discussion. So that's really my aim, to introduce a couple of ideas related to Akhtamar, sort of looking at the Shnorhali's broader context. This is like right before his Catholicosate, before he becomes a Catholicos, by looking closely at a tense and pivotal moment in Armenian church history during his time. Now, the excommunication of Akhtamar in 1113 wasn't just a minor dispute. It was a turning point, a bold move to assert centralized authority under a rising Cilician see. As I have been thinking through this paper, one thing that keeps becoming a bit more clear is that establishing a Catholicosate is no small thing. Yeah, it's something to take it for granted. And Akhtamar actually stood for over 780 years, a powerful historic center. Perhaps one of the reasons for this is the span of 800 years was my doctoral research question, which was the martyrdom of Catholicos Zakaria II, essentially the blood of the martyrs, really speaking the history of what the Akhtamar Catholicosate and also Akhtarunis stood for, even tracing it back to the late 9th century with the Hamazes and Sahak martyrs. There is this continuation with martyrs in their history. And excommunication, that's no small or light matter either. So we have to ask, why did Catholicos Grigol Pahlavuni take such a maybe dramatic or drastic step? Why excommunicate Akhtamar, a place so deeply woven into Armenian sacred, religious, and political history, both before Cilicia and long after? I always find it helpful to geographically orient ourselves. I know this is no news for many of us here in the audience, but for us, for some of us, really before setting up the tension between the Pahlavuni and the Ahtamar, first, I think the geographical orientation helps us to see the distance between the two places. Ahtamar to our right, Cilicia to our left. And in modern terms, really, we're talking about 355 miles, perhaps something like between San Diego and San Francisco. Not that huge of a distance, but still, in medieval times, to travel from Lake Van to the Cilician region, one would have had to actually go around the lake because of all the mountainous regions from Ahtamar to Bitlis, from Bitlis to Diyarbakir, then eventually into the Gaziantep, modern Gaziantep area. One of the claims from the Ahtamar's legitimacy was that the historic Greater Armenian homeland, the claim that the Pahlavuni's lineage, the claim for the Pahlavuni's was their lineage to Gregory the Illuminator. 2 points I will sort of return to throughout the paper. As I turn to describe the land and the location, as we see sometimes say in modern terms, location is everything, we will begin to see more clearly the power that geography and ancestral lands hold. Ahtamar is no ordinary landscape. It is a land steeped in history, a land that carried weight for the Artsunis, who, like the Pahlavunis, reached deep into their past to anchor their legitimacy. For one, both of them actually trace their claims in different ways back to Gregory the Illuminator, the sacred lineage that conferred not just bloodline, but the right to power, the authority, and really how one identifies their Armenian Christian identity. This is a Nazir satellite shot of Lake Van. And I just show this just to kind of highlight the topography of the area, and perhaps to say that nowhere does the ancient struggle between land and lineage come into a sharper focus than the one gleaming with the waters of Lake Van, where the island of Ahtamar rises like a crown, a place where stone, sea, and sacred bloodlines contrast with the meaning of spiritual legitimacy, rule, and identity. And Ahtamar is one of at least 4 islands in the area, just to also broaden our understanding of the topography, the landscape. Here is Lim Island, which what is left of it is the Anabat, very difficult to see, but perhaps, oh, here, I can actually point it in this region right here. Another island in the Lake Van region, actually the area where we see most of the water level changes is near the Katuts Island, which recently excavated, and actually the National Geographic did a piece on this, on the dives of what they discovered of the Urartunian remains, not too far from this part. So just sort of contextualizing the geological, or the land, the power of this area. And if any one of us ever has had the opportunity to visit Ahtamar or Lake Van, perhaps I will speak from my perspective, it literally feels heaven on earth. And perhaps this image will communicate a little bit of that. Lake Van and Ahtamar is going through its sort of sacred geographical points, is the largest lake in modern day Turkey, in historic Greater Armenia. It lies in a vast tectonic basin at over 1,600 meters. And again, for as ambitious as I can be, I did not drive around the lake. It's big. It's framed by snow-capped peaks, including the towering Arthos Mountain to the south and the volcanic mountain of Sipan to the north. The lake stretches about 120 kilometers from east to west, with waters tinted a unique turquoise blue due set to high salt content. The salt content actually is so high that it doesn't freeze over the winter, even though it is significantly below zero. Nestled just 3 kilometers off the shores of Lake Van, actually literally from the place of Vostan, a point to make about the Ahtamar-Vostan connection in its sort of the Artsuni kingdoms that were established quite early before the time period we're speaking of. rises with the, actually, I'm going to skip that for time purposes. I was going to go more into the description, but as we say, location is everything, but another cliche, pictures speak a million words there. So I'll just allow the picture to really say what it is. So at the heart of it stands the Holy Cross Church, built in 915, 921, under King Gabik I Artsruni. It's constructed from the rose or red colored doof stones. The cathedral is adorned with intrinsic stone reliefs that tell biblical stories and royal legends. Now, this dramatic meeting of water, rock, sky gave Ahtamar both its spiritual allure and its strategic value. The Ahtamar Catholicosate, centered at the Church of the Holy Cross on the island Lake Fond, was established in 1113, the same year where Catholicos Grigor Pahlavani assumed his role in Garmirvan Kinkesun until his death in 1166 when Nersēs Shnorhali became the Catholicos. Now, this was not the first time Ahtamar served as the see for Armenian Catholicoi or Catholicosate. In the year 927, shortly after the construction of the cathedral, the Armenian Catholicosate moved from Debin to Ahtamar and remained there until 947. Between the 8th to the 11th centuries, again before the time of this excommunication dispute arising, several Catholicoi made their residence at Ahtamar, including the well-renowned Catholicos Hovhannes Drasnagetsi, who was there actually up to his death in 929. For centuries, it served not only as a center of worship, but also as a political and ecclesiastical stronghold, a place where Armenian Catholicoi resided during turbulent eras of foreign rule. This is the Islamic period. In this period, the existence of several simultaneous Catholicoi was not just a foreign idea to Armenia's history, but also to the region's history. Under Catholicos Grigor II Vagayaser of Bahlavuni, there were something like 5 Catholicoi. This was a special development that took place under the ecclesiastical rule of Grigor II Vagayaser, who is the great uncle of both Grigor Pahlavuni III, who establishes the Cilician Catholicosate, and also Nersēs Shnorhali. As the Armenian community spread out in different areas, Vagayaser recognized the importance of autonomous local churches with the authority to make the necessary decisions for their particular regions. In this regard, Vagayaser released a whole series of decision-making powers to Catholicoi in different parts of Armenia, to properly oversee their flocks. Vagayaser's death brought this phenomenon to a full stop and raised major issues in relation to its succession. In the memory of the Ahtamar ecclesiastics, the existence of the 5 Catholicoi was perhaps one of the reasons that was very much fresh in their mind about their own right to establish or to actually find a legitimate reason for their jurisdiction. Now, at this juncture, the Artsruni branch of Ecclesiastes decided to establish the Catholicosate of Ahtamar, as it was a place that formerly held such precedent. For the Artsrunis, establishing a Catholicosate to rule in the ecclesiastical sphere maintained a sense of primacy, which they had as a kingdom, also fresh in their memory during the dynastic rules that came before, centuries before. The continuator of Tovma Artsruni records that the initial quarrel between the Catholicosate of Ahtamar, David I, whose incumbent is from 1113 to 1165, right about the time of Pahlavuni Grigor III, and the main Catholicosate relates to the disagreement as to where the preeminent see of the ecclesiastical authority ought to be, in what would come to be later known as the See of Cilicia, where the Armenians had political and administrative power, or, as David I argued, on the Armenian plateau near the Lake Van region, what I just covered in its topography and geographic scenes, which is also the historic land where Gregory the Illuminator's relics remain, and relics including several of the belt and the arm of Gregory and so on and so forth. So not an argument of lineage, but a sacred religious history. Due to their inability to achieve consensus on this issue and other doctrinal issues, the Armenian Church then experienced a division in its ecclesiastical hierarchy. In the case of Gregory III, the lineage of the Catholicosate played a major, if not a primary role in the selection of the incumbent, which remained true quite until about Gregory the Sixth Apirat, which, I mean, this essentially comes to an end in 1203, where the lineage dies out. So I guess the question to raise is how much actually that becomes a strong argument for Gregory III. Another concern for the hierarchs in Ahtamar and the Van region was that a Catholicosate in Cilicia is vulnerable to Latin influence from the newly established Crusader states. It is true Ahtamar was under Islamic rule, but Cilicia was posited to be deeply impacted by Western ideological forces. Now, during the years of this quarrel, the Catholicosate of Ahtamar then becomes a Hakator, an anti-Catholicosate, excommunicated by Gregory the Pahlavi. Although efforts for the reunification of the two Catholicosates would later become possible under, or starts under Grigor Tatevatsi, but really only takes its efforts into sort of the fruition of that process through Toma Mezzopetsi in 1441. That's something to explore a bit, I guess, in a separate set, but I do want to return to these two forces of land and legacy, or sorry, the land and the legitimacy of the lineage of the two arguments. So from sacred land to symbolic authority, the stark beauty of Ahtamar's landscape was not merely aesthetic. It shaped the island's role in Armenian political and spiritual life. Rising from the waters of Lake Van, Ahtamar became a natural sanctuary. Physically set apart, yet symbolically at the heart of Greater Armenia, it positioned itself as a fortress against threats and a stage for asserting religious independence. When foreign empires like the Arabic Caliphates, Byzantine forces, and later the Seljuks dominated the Armenian plateau, Ahtamar's isolation allowed for its preserved Armenian sovereignty, almost like a miniature. In the 10th century, King Gagik I Artsruni deliberately transformed the island into the royal and ecclesiastical capital of the Artsruni kings. Here I have an image of Gagik I as a relief carved into the becoming part of sort of the biblical continuity of the stories told on the on the Holy Cross Church. The Cathedral of the Holy Cross, with its sculpted facades depicting scenes from Genesis to the Gospels, projected a vision of Armenian Christian kingship that was both ancient and divinely sanctioned, or at least in their mind. Or even if one to visit can actually see the grandeur of this. By the medieval period, this sacred geography took a deeper ecclesiastical meaning. A rival Catholicosate arose, that is Cilicia in the west. Eventually, later, we have the Ichmiadzin in the north. Ahtamar's leaders claimed that their physical rootedness in Greater Armenia made them the legitimate heirs of the apostolic tradition. One other area to highlight, other than the land, the Artsruni sort of heritage, is the area, just going back to this map found in Hewson's collection, just narrowing into the area of Lake Van. Ahtamar was one of its very many religious centers established. So if I just zero it into this other map, at one point, by the 11th century, there were something like 100 monasteries only just around the Lake Van region. And just to highlight one more sort of an affinity to the spiritual heritage of the area and the legitimacy of it is not a gabang. And I don't have to say much about that, about the power and the influence of the southern, this is literally south of a part of the Lake Van region. So just to bring this part of my presentation to a close about Ahtamar, their claims were that they are a historic land. They possess Gregory Illuminator's relics, belts, arm. In the legacy of the Vagayas, there are multiple Catholicoi. It was not a foreign idea for them to actually exist as the Catholico state. And finally, trying to make claims to their biblical, and however strong of a claim this was, we can discuss. The Artsuni claim to biblical descent, that is of the house of the Sennacherib, which we read about the Assyrian kings in the Bible, mentioned in 2 Kings and Isaiah, where the Vasuragan, the Artsuni kings, really named them essentially descendants or claimed ancestry to this lineage, and Sennacherib being the last king who ruled in the area in 1021. With those main points about Ahtamar's argument, really about their legitimacy, I would like to move to what it is that Pahlavinis were actually saying. And very briefly, I will try to keep this brief. At the heart of this dispute of lineage, family lineage, is something found in the vision of Sahak Bartev that we read about both in Parpetsi and in Horenatsi. Now, the Catholicos Sahak, who was the Catholicos of the Church 387 to, or the beginning of 400 to 439, he was the great-grandson of Gregory the Illuminator. Now, this is connecting the lineage to Gregory the Illuminator, Lusavoric, not through relics or some sacred findings in the planting of the church, but actually Gregory himself. That we are lineages of Gregory and have the legitimacy to continue the Catholic state as heirs of Grigor the Illuminator. What was Sahak's vision? We can read about this in more detail, but just a very brief summary. Sahak's vision to continue the Catholic state through Gregory the Illuminator, one might think, came to an end because he did not have any sons, and for generations, the Pahlavinis there were no sons in their family. So how can this be? Almost makes me think of some sort of biblical motifs there, where it actually continues through their mother lineage. And Grigor Vagayase, the great uncle of both Shnorhali and Grigor III, wake up to this idea of Vagayase wakes up, becomes more aware of this dream, and realizes, oh, we are connected to Gregory the Illuminator through his mother. So based on this vision, there is this effort to actually reestablish that very place where the Armenian Christian legitimate sort of rule continues through them and not through the Artsuni's claim, although the Artsuni have this claim to sacred land and geography being Armenian, Greater Armenian. So the claim is powerful in the sense that he is not just making a claim to being the great-grandson of the founder of the Armenian Christianity. It is the fact that the vision is fulfilled in them. Here, I'm just capturing a couple of the images we have seen earlier in our presentation, at the beginning of our presentation, just to kind of show the topography and also the land of Hromkva. But really, in summary, just beyond the visual, just to bring my talk to these two main claims from both the Ahtamar and the Cilician debates. There were other points to really get into, especially the theological. What was it really that the Artsunis claimed about their legitimacy, about how the Latin influence could actually blur the lines between both the Armenian Christianity, if I may put it this way, the authentic Armenian Christianity. So thus the excommunication of Akhtamar was not merely sort of an act disconnected from all of these various complexities, theological, dynastic, but it was a battle over whether Armenian Christian unity should be anchored in the sacred lands of Vaspuragan, or is it a sacred bloodline of Gregory the Illuminator, its heirs? Just to conclude, as I was preparing also for the saying, and just so as a segue to Sergio's paper, I was very much captured by the old saying attributed to wise Solomon, "There is nothing really new under the sun," which echoes here as I turn to a tense and revealing episodes of the Armenian church history. On the surface, we learn of seas being established, excommunications declared, but these are not just the outer layer, but these are just really the outer layer, if I may say that. Beneath them are internal rivals, external pressures, varying visions, and deeper struggles, all condensed into the boiling point, forcing a confrontation between the fundamental questions of legitimacy. That is, who holds rightful power to authority? Is it determined by lineage, by geography, both, by something else? These became then and now the pivotal questions of identity. And even today, we see this old formula invoked in new forms. In our case, too, the same question rises: what does it mean to be Armenian? To be Armenian Christian? Is it a language? Is it a land? Is it blood? I'm eager to hear Professor Sergio Laporta's paper on the question of Shnorhali and identity. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Shahinian, for opening the panel with this very engaging presentation. And we now turn to Dr. Sergio Laporta, Professor Sergio Laporta, coming to us from Fresno, where his current position is as Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities at California State University, Fresno. And he was formerly the holder of the Hagen Isabel Berberian Chair in Armenian Studies at Fresno for several years. In addition to publishing a study on Armenian commentaries on the works of Dionysius the Areopagite, he's written articles on medieval Armenian intellectual history and cultural interactions with the Islamicate, Byzantine, and Latinate worlds. His most current project is a new edition, translation, and commentary with Dr. Alison Baca on the 8th century history of Levant, submitted to the Lamine series of the University of Chicago Press, a really wonderful and erudite translation and especially commentary on the historical and political and religious details contained in that important 8th century history. And so the topic that he's going to speak to us about today is Saint Nersess and the expansion of Armenian identity. Professor Laporta.
Thank you, Dr. Allen, and I'm sorry I couldn't be with you all there today. My position has actually gotten worse. I am the interim dean of our School of Education and Human Development, and so that means I don't even get out of my office normally, and but I would much rather be with you, I can tell you that much. I'd like to thank Dr. Shahinian and everyone who put this conference together for their kind invitation for me to speak and for making it possible for me to do it via Zoom. I'm going, even though we did this for years, I'm still uncertain when we do it. So I'm going to try and share my screen. And hopefully this will work. And hopefully everybody is seeing it.
Yes, it looks good.
Great. Thank you. This, as Ani said with her paper, is sort of a speculative paper and mainly to raise some questions and to give some answers that I'm more than happy for everyone to disagree with, because hopefully I'll learn something more about it. But in the 1150s, the abbot of the monastery of Hakhbat, Gheorghe, wrote a letter to Bishop Nersēs Shnorhali, brother of the Armenian Catholicos and later Catholicos himself. requesting information on a certain Saint Sergius, about whom he had heard from another monk. Nersess was unfamiliar with the exact details of the life of the saint, so he wrote to a Syriac monk at the monastery of Mar Barsalma near Melitene or Malatia to see if they had a copy of the life of this saint amongst their books, and if they did, whether they could send him a translation of it. The Syriac monk responded that they had the lives of 4 saints by the name of Sarkis. Sarkis, the famous one, the friend of Bacchus, but in addition to that, Sarkis, a Sarkis who was martyred in Amida Diyarbakir, a Sarkis who was martyred in Dara in Syria, and a general Sarkis who was martyred with his son in Persia. Which one did Nersess want? Shnorhali realized that all the other ones, except the friend of Bacchus, were unknown to him, but that he certainly wanted the life of General Sarkis. The monastery, Barsama, had a certain Mikhail who was knowledgeable in Armenian. They had him translate the text, and then they sent it to Nersess. Upon receiving the translation, however, Nersess realized that the Armenian wasn't that great. He needed to polish it up so that it read more like Armenian, which is an interesting concept of itself, but we'll get to that later maybe. Upon finishing his refinements in 1158, Nersess sent the martyrdom of General Sarkis to the abbot of Hakhbat with instructions to spread it wherever the gospel was preached and to perform the martyr's remembrance with a public feast. Now, the story of General Sarkis may not be familiar to everyone, although it was popular in Syria and in Arabia in particular, where it's already mentioned in the 8th century. But I will briefly summarize it here. Saint Sarkis was Greek from Caesarea in Cappadocia, and he was a famous soldier who rose to the rank of general in the imperial army under Constantine the Great. And like the emperor, he spread the Christian faith and destroyed pagan shrines throughout his homeland. However, when the Emperor Julian the Apostate came to power, Jesus appeared to Sarkis and told him to get out of there. So Sarkis dispensed of all his wealth and belongings and took to the road with his son Mardiros. According to the text, they went to the realm of the Armenians and were received warmly by King Tiran of Greater Armenia. One wonders here if this is one of the ways that Nersēs Shnorhali may have polished the text a bit. But in any case, the armies of Julian pushed into Syria and creating fear in Armenia. And for the sake of King Tiran, Sarkis fled to King Shapur of Persia, who was also very happy to receive him. When Julian prepared to invade the borderland between the Roman and Persian empires, the Shah sent Sarkis there to defend his territory. Although the Persian army was afraid of the size of the Roman force, Sarkis encouraged them to accept Jesus Christ, who would deliver them in this battle, and many were baptized. They defeated the Romans, whose forces reported that they had seen an incorporeal power and heard a voice say, "Do not dare battle with Saint Sarkis, the servant of God." Some among the Persian forces, however, were disgruntled by the success and plotted against Sarkis. They informed the Shah that Sarkis had rebelled against the gods and him, and had persuaded his troops to convert and unite with the Romans. The Shah sent Sarkis' son Mardiros with a letter for his father summoning him to court. Mardiros, however, was captured along the way by enemy troops, and Sarkis was despondent when he found out. He prayed for 3 days and his son was released. When he got to his father, he told him that the enemy soldiers started killing one another, and a vision appeared that said they would all die unless they gave the boy back to his father. Although the Shah found Sarkis innocent of all the charges of insubordination and rebellion, he ordered Sarkis and his son to sacrifice to fire and idols. Sarkis refused to offer sacrifices and insulted the fire, so the Magi struck Sarkis and killed Martyros. The Shah prevented them from killing Sarkis too, but had him imprisoned. A few days later, the Shah questioned Sarkis, but the latter remained loyal to his faith, so the Shah ordered him stripped, taken out of the city, and beheaded. And that's basically a very brief description of the life. Now, although the martyrology describes Sarkis as a Greek from Cappadocia, he does not seem to have been very popular among members of the contemporary imperial church, as opposed to Sarkis and Bacchus, that Sarkis was very popular. Indeed, in his letter to the abbot George, Nersess specifically observes that the Greeks and Georgians doubt the veracity of the life of this saint. And so he had verified the details of Sargis's life so that they would henceforth be silent. But why, other than Sarkis's distance from Greek and Georgian communities, was he such a popular saint amongst Armenians in the 12th century that an abbot wrote to the brother of the Catholicos to ascertain verifiable information about him, and that Nersess would feel compelled to direct the worship and interpretation of Sarkis's life and martyrdom? Undoubtedly, one reason was that Sarkis was a military saint. The 10th and 13th centuries witnessed the reproduction of images and hagiographies of early Christian martyrs who had served as soldiers throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. As elsewhere, Armenian society underwent militarization during this period, and social mobility through ascending the ranks of the military was common. The imperial incursions of the 11th century had reduced and dispersed the Nakharar families and their dependents. Many of the warriors that had served the houses went to serve in the imperial army, in the army of the emerging Georgian kingdom, and in Seljuk and Turkic armies. Some became mercenaries, some brigands. Military saints became important rhetorical markers of military conquest and legitimacy. For example, the author of the History of David, King of Kings, ascribes the victory of David II King David Bagrationi, known as the Builder or Restorer, over the Seljuks at the Battle of Didguri in 1121 to the active assistance of St. George. And divine intervention, he adds, to which the infidels also attested, much as the defeated Romans attested to St. Sarkis's efficacy. And this is a common trope, obviously. Vartan Adaveltsi also reports an incident concerning a relic of St. Sarkis that predates the translation of the life, but clearly echoes it. According to Vartan, an innumerable host of infidels gathered on the plain of Gog in 1130 and attempted to destroy the cross which housed the martyr's relic. But the Lord drove the men crazy and they wound up killing each other, right? And this is also reminiscent of what happened to those men who had captured Sarkis' son Martyros. But again, this is a common martyrological trope. But having a military saint such as Sarkis to rally around would have been especially useful in maintaining group identity in the mixed armies of the period. The leading generals of the Georgian kingdom, Zakare and Ivane, known as the Zakarian or Mekher were both of Armenian origin, although the younger brother Ivane adopted the Chalcedonism of the Royal Georgian Church. In the late 12th century, Zakare suggested reforms for the Armenian members of the Georgian forces in order to reduce their distinctiveness. According to the 13th century historian Kyriakos Ganzaketsi, one of the causes of friction between the soldiers was that the Georgian troops repeatedly insulted the Armenian fighters for their liturgical practices. Somewhat differently, but nonetheless similar, an interesting martyrdom from the mid-12th century presents the problem of Armenians in the Danishmendid army. Their father had converted to Islam, but their mother had not. They were raised as Christians, but when they came of age, they joined the ranks of the army of Yahya Basan. They were eventually informed upon, like Saint Sarkis, and martyred for apostasy. So it may be understandable why military saints for Armenians would be necessary in these mixed armies that either they're mixed with imperial fighters or Georgian fighters or Turkmen fighters. But while the attraction to a military saint is understandable, we may still ask why Sarkis, especially as Armenians already had one, Vartan Mamegonian, who died at the famous Battle of Avaraya. And indeed, Nersēs Shnorhali also promoted his cult, penning the famous liturgical hymns Aratsielk and Norachrash Pesakavor for the celebration of the martyrdom of Vartan and his soldiers. It is possibly worth noting that while Vartan was considered a saint in the historiographical tradition by the 10th century, he does not seem to have entered the liturgical calendar or enjoyed an official ecclesiastical cult until the late 11th or early 12th century. At the very beginning of the 11th century, Stepanos Asochik-Taronetsi, as Greenwood has elucidated in his translation of the history, is more preoccupied with establishing the exact date of the martyrdom of the Ravondian priests than he is with the Battle of Avaraya. Stepanos specifies that the martyrdom of the Ravondian happened, quote, in the month of Rotitz on the 26th day of the month, that is July, a Sunday. By contrast, no such precision is granted to the date of the Battle of Avaraya and the death of Vartan and his soldiers. This discrepancy suggests that no set feast day had yet been established for commemorating Vartan and his companions' martyrdom at Avarer, although it is possible that one for the Ravondiank may have been recognized in ecclesiastical practice. The conclusion based on Taronetsi that Vartan lacked cultic sanctity finds corroboration in contemporary liturgical books. If we look at the oldest lectionaries, no reading is provided for him in those Jashots of the 9th to 11th centuries, nor in the Festal compilation or Donegan of 1194 that's held in Paris, or the old Festal collection, the Donatsuits, copied in 1287, found in Venice 186. In fact, the earliest liturgical commemoration for the Vardanan saints I have been able to locate is found listed on the Hrotits 30 in Jashots Matanadran 832 of 1154. Now, the commemoration of their date on Hrotits 30th or August 5th is where it remained until Catholico Simeon Yerevansi moved it to February. But it should be noted that Charles Renou has identified Matanadran 832 as the oldest Cilician Jashots. And I think that's important that maybe his feast was initiated in Cilicia. And I would hazard that the liturgical incorporation of Vartanans occurred during the reform efforts of Grigor Vagayaser, but Vartan's cult was enhanced during the hymnographic work and liturgical reforms of Nersēs Shnorhali. Shnorhali further expanded the lectionary, and between 1154 and his death, composed the two Shadagans for the martyrs' commemoration mentioned earlier, Aratsialk and Norash Psakavor. Following this, commemoration of Vartan and his companions appears more frequently in liturgical books, including in all the four great recensions of the Armenian Synaxarion or Haismavurk, compiled from the mid-13th century onwards, as well as in the collections of hymns known as the Sharak Notes and Gansaran. The cult of Vartan and his companions thus had established support, particularly in Cilicia. But if onomastics are any measure of popularity, Sarkis had a far broader constituency in the 12th and 13th centuries than did Vartan. And this is collected from the High Ansana Nuneru Bararan, this sort of data. So, take it with a grain of salt, but nonetheless, if it's representative, from the 5th to 10th century, the name of Sarkis is attested 45 times, in the 11th century 16 times, in the 12th century 41 times, and in the 13th century a whopping 114 times. By contrast, Vartan is attested 34 times between 5th and 10th centuries, in the 11th century 3 times, in the 12th century 18 times, and in the 13th century 72 times. While the simple accident of preservation cannot be discounted in judging the worth of these figures, they nonetheless show a pattern. The dramatic increase in the attestation of Vartan's name between the 12th and 13th century, as that of Sarkis's, may also be attributed to a general popularity of and affinity for military saints. The combination of the increased frequency of Sarkis's name, Nersess's urgent translation of Sarkis's martyrdom and promotion of his cult, the implication of the saint's currency among Armenians from his admitted controversial status among Greeks and Georgians, and Vartan Araveltsi's notice about the efficacy of the general's relics all point to the emergence of Saint Sarkis as a figure with whom Armenians particularly identified and continue to do so. The reason for his assumption of the position we would more naturally expect Vartan Mamagonian to hold, however, are open to speculation. And I would hazard that Sarkis's frontier experience may have resonated more with contemporary Armenians than Vartan's. Vartan was a rooted figure, the leader of a prestigious clan. He fought for the Persians and then as the head of an Armenian army. Sarkis rose to prominence because of his military ability, left his home, fought for the Romans, then the Persians, and in the end was persecuted by both. In the fluid political climate of the 12th century, where many made their fortunes or careers through military service, the uprooted nature of Sarkis's life would have been more familiar. Similarly, caught between Byzantium, Georgia, the Seljuks, and various Turkic principalities, who were identified as with Persians, many soldiers would have sympathized with his flexibility and willingness to fight first for Rome and then for Persia, as well as his being favored and attacked by both. Above all, they may have respected that despite changes in place, employer, and circumstances, Sarkis did not waver in his sense of who he was. Some listeners may have been comforted by the ability of Sarkis's prayers to free his captured son. Others may have been inspired by the general whose men were willing to follow him to the end. In total, although the martyrology shared many of the rhetorical tropes of Vartan Mamegonian's story, the particulars may have been just much closer to contemporary reality of the military frontier. Another related but somewhat counterintuitive reason for Sarkis's popularity may have been his alterity. As mentioned, Sarkis was not Armenian but Greek. Although he did receive a favorable reception by King Tiran, in the version at least presented by Nersess, his connection to Armenia was somewhat tenuous. Again, many Armenians may have recognized his outsider status in themselves. On the other hand, Sarkis may have proved to be a useful symbol for welcoming others into the Armenian community, much as the martyr found refuge in the Armenian kingdom, even if only briefly. Brought in from both a different ethnic and literary community, Sarkis was Armenized through Nersess's translation. We recall that Nersess specifically comments that he polished the original translation because although it conveyed the sense of Sarkis's martyrdom, it did not conform to the aesthetics of literary Armenian. We can thus observe here a parallel movement from a minimalist position for inclusion within a literary ethnos to a maximalist one, in which the text is no longer a translation, but becomes a work of native composition. We may catch a glimpse of how this Sarkis the outsider, rather than the general, may have functioned in another martyrology of the 1170s. The story is about a Persian Muslim, most possibly a Kurd, named Abu Bakr, who lived near the city of Dvin. He converts to Christianity, adopts the name Hofsep, and is martyred. An intriguing aspect of this martyrdom is that 3 people named Sarkis are involved in the young man's life, the first 2 in instructing him in the faith. And a 4th Sarkis, also a convert who became a priest, heard about his martyrdom and traveled to the location to acquire his relics, which he managed to do at the risk of his own life. In the earliest version of the martyrdom, Hofsep journeys from monastery to monastery, but he's rebuffed by some of their communities. And he stays for a few years at Hakhpat, the same monastery of which Georgi, who sent the request to Nersess, was abbot, but it's unclear what he specifically does there. In the slightly later version of this martyrology, as it appears in the Highsmith work, however, he is not only trained at Hakhpat among other monasteries in the region, he is sent to the Catholicos see at Hromkla, where he receives the blessing of the Catholicos, Nersēs Shnorhali. Thus, even if the presence of multiple Sarkises in the original version of this martyrology is just coincidence and reflects the accurate reporting of the people who were involved in Hofsep's life, which I don't really think is the case, it seems clear that at least in its reworking, associations of Saint Sarkis, the insider-outsider, have been read into the text to the point where Shnorhali translates this Muslim youth into an Armenian Christian with his blessing. Shnorhali's translation of the life of Saint Sarkis, as well as his letter to Georgi, the neo-martyrologies of the young soldiers in the Danishmandadid army who had not converted, and of Hofsep of Dvin, thus articulate a very different ideology of Armenian identity. This alternative Armenianness would seem to be defined less by some perceived ethnic community than by the outsider experience of dispersion and the competitiveness of a pluralistic militarized society. This expression of identity exhibits a versatility in that it was able to reinforce Armenian exceptionalism and exclusivity, as well as to incorporate the fellow other. The ecclesiastical elite was still very much involved in constructing this identity and foregrounded its Christian component. But though Nersess may have shaped the specific contours of its performance, he was likely responding to a more widespread and nebulous phenomenon among the local population. Moreover, and in conclusion, Shnorhali's adoption and adaptation of the cult of Saint Sarkis is a terrific display of the pastoral sensitivity that he had for the differing needs of his dispersed flock and his willingness to change the church to meet them. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Laporta, for this fascinating talk on Saint Sarkis in this time period. Our last speaker on the panel is Professor Roberta Erving, who of course is known to us all, but I'll just say a little bit about her academic background. In addition to her academic studies at Columbia University under Nina Garsoyan and James Russell, she was blessed to be a longtime disciple of the late Archbishop Norar Bogharian, curator of manuscripts for the Armenian monastery of St. James in Jerusalem, and of Bishop Gyureh Gapikyan, Armenian overseer of the status quo in the holy places. She taught for several years in Jerusalem's Holy Translators School and lectured at other institutions in Jerusalem before joining the faculty here at St. Nersēs, where she is professor of Armenian Christian Studies and has been so for maybe a couple decades now. She's an expert on many topics related to late medieval Armenian monastic culture, education, especially from the 12th to 14th centuries, the high point of Armenian monastic, of Armenian monasticism. Her title for the topic she'll present on today is called "He Was My Brother in the Flesh and My Father in the Spirit: The Quiet Presence of Grigor III Pahlavuni in the Writings of Nersēs IV Shnorhali." And we're just getting the presentation PowerPoint set up, and then we'll hear from Professor Irving.
We're going to stay in the kind of speculative, thoughtful mode that we've been in, because this presentation grew out of a wonderment that I've had for some time, but I've only recently begun to investigate it. And so I'm bringing it here to this conference in the absolute confidence that some of you present know more about it than I do. And I look forward to your comments and input. The wonderment is this: is it not somehow odd that Grigor III Pahlavuni headed the Armenian Church for just over half a century, 1113 to his death in 1166? The longest Catholicosal reign in the history of the Armenian Church, I believe. And yet, despite his long career, if people recognize his name at all, it's because of the long shadow cast by his famous younger brother and successor, Nersēs IV Shnorhali. And it wasn't just Nersess's shadow that overshadowed Grigor III. Known to his contemporaries as Hokur Vagayaser, junior martyrophile, he's also much less well known than Grigor II, his namesake and the original bearer of that cognomen. This is a rather mystifying phenomenon, in my opinion, because like his more famous great uncle, Grigor III was a translator of saints' lives. Like his more famous brother, he was a hymnographer, he was a biblical exegete, the two being closely related in his mind and practice. He was an educator who commissioned works of exegesis. He was an apologist, he was a theologian. He and his brother worked together. Hamashunch, as we heard yesterday, they shared the same breath, the same soul, the same ideology for 6 decades. And Nersēs wrote some of Grigor's correspondence for him. They spoke with one voice. But of the 80+ illuminations that picture Nersēs, which we were introduced to yesterday, only a very precious small handful include his brother. And so I'd like to think about this. I'd like to explore this a little bit with you for the next few minutes. And the written form of this presentation will explore it in much more detail. There are 2 things I would like us to look at in this short time. We'll look at the first more briefly, I think, and the second in somewhat more extensive form. So first of all, the question, what do we know about how people in his time viewed Grigor III? There are a number of contemporary sources that mention him. Among Armenians, think of Samvel Anetsi, who wrote his chronicle at Grigor's behest. Continuator of Tov Marjuni's history, Mateos Urhaetsi's chronology, the chronicle of Constable Sambat, later Stepanos Orbelian, Vartan Araveltsi has an encomium, on the restored Pahlavuni Catholicosate, including Krikor II, Krikor III, and Nersess. So there's some stuff out there. There are also non-Armenian writers, like the Crusader hierarchs Archbishop William II of Tyre and Bishop Otto von Freising. They focused, understandably, on Krikor's relationship with Rome. So first of all, William of Tyre talks about Krikor's presence at the Roman Catholic Council of Antioch in 1141, which he attended together with Nersess before they separated and Krikor went on alone with the Roman delegation to Jerusalem without his younger brother. William says, the great patriarch of Armenia, head and chief of all the bishops of Cappadocia and Media and Persia, and both Armenias, supreme chief of priests, who is called the Catholicos. And then the interesting part for us, the articles of faith in which his people seem to differ from us, so there's discussion about what Armenians believe and so on, were discussed with him, and he promised reform in many respects. That's interesting. One wonders what Krikor actually said, but the perception was that he was in full agreement that his own church's tradition was defective compared to that of Rome. Bishop Otto describes something that happened just a bit later, a delegation sent by Krikor, empowered by Krikor, given its task by Krikor, in 1143, that finally made it to Viterbo in Italy in 1145 to consult with the Romans concerning the Eucharist. This is a meeting apparently that Otto was present at, and he records his impressions. He says, they, the Armenians, had come asking that they be instructed in the form of the sacrifice according to the Roman custom. The Roman bishop, I think it's Eugenius III at that point, receiving them gladly, admitted them to the solemnization of the Mass and admonished them to observe carefully all that took place there. One of them, one of the Armenians, a bishop, saw that while the supreme pontiff was performing the holy mysteries, a sunbeam flashed about his head in shining splendor, and in its light, two doves ascended and descended, not one, two doves ascended and descended. The bishop realized that this was God's doing, and so was more inspired to bring the Armenians into obedience to the Roman see. Okay. We need to contrast this as we're thinking about what we can learn from these sources. We want to contrast this with the entry for Krikor's enthronement in 1113, given in Samuel Anetzi's chronicle, which also backtracks to describe his visit to Jerusalem after the council in Antioch. Samuel says, when he went to the holy city of Jerusalem, there the race of the Romans, the princes of the region who were called Franks, recognized and understood the expansive outpouring of divine grace upon the hierarch. And together with the elegance and appropriately beautiful appearance of his body, he was supposed to have been quite tall and handsome, they recognized also the beauty of his soul and the truth in his entire statement of faith, which he pronounced with brilliant and canonical order and measured doctrinal richness. They rejoiced with approbation. There's nothing here about Krikor promising to make reforms to his defective faith, and established yet greater love with the patriarch and with our nation. I think the disconnect between Samuel Anetzi's statement and the previous two writers is rather obvious. Which account is truer to Krikor's character and policy? Even if we decide that question, in any case, none of the sources, Armenian or other, give us very much insight into Krikor as a person, into his goals as a churchman, into his motivations, or his approach to intellectual questions. For that, we are forced to turn to the one who knew him best, Nersess. the little brother that he raised and nurtured from their father's death onward, and who was his right-hand man for 60 years, who, one could also argue, Krikor had strong-armed and painted into a corner such that he became a clergyman himself. Nersēs mentions his brother Krikor overtly and implicitly in a number of different writings. We have time, I think, for a very quick look at just two of them. So I picked one from the beginning of Nersēs's career and one from the last chapter of his career. There are others that we could include. The early work is one that has already been mentioned multiple times in this conference, his Vibhasano tune, his epic history, described in one of its subtitles as an epic after the manner of Homer. A youthful work in which Nersēs comes to grips with the deep roots of his family and with the obligations that that history imposes on him. It was 1121 when he wrote it, so he was either a new bishop or he was about to become one, which is, one would think, a proper moment for some introspection, some trying to understand the patterns that have led one to this point. In his 20s at the time of its composition, Nersēs begins the epic with a discourse on the Trinity, creation of human beings, continues on up until Noah and his descendant Torpo. From that point on, he methodically follows through the writings of Moses Khorenatsi to lay out the history of the Arshaguni kings, his own progenitors, from Agatangeros, again following it and very methodically. He takes the story of the most important figure in his family's lineage, Saint Krikor the Illuminator, including the details of his torture and imprisonment in excruciating quantity, the conversion of Turdat, thus of Armenia, the visit of Krikor and Turdat to Constantine. Then for the story of Krikor's successors, he goes back to Khorenatsi, once again following very closely, sometimes even verbatim. And upon reaching the time of Krikor's great-grandson, his own namesake Nersess, Nersess Pahlavuni, Nersēs adds Paustos Byzant to the list of sources that he structurally and verbally adheres to in his story. So for our present purposes, this epic becomes most interesting when he begins the story of his own immediate family. This has also been pointed out in other presentations, starting with the 10th century polymath Krikor Magistros. Magistros' son Vahram, who after his military and political career became a monk, was chosen to head the Armenian church as Krikor II, first Catholicos to carry that name since the Illuminator himself. And in a bid to make the restored Pahlavuni Catholicosate a lasting dynasty, he wanted it to go at least as long as the original had, and it did almost exactly. Krikor appointed Krikor Vagayasir appointed not only his own successor, his nephew Parser, the name should be familiar to you all by now, of Ani, but also Vagayasir appointed the successor of his successor. He told Parser that when it was time, Parser would appoint as his successor his nephew Krikor, Nersēs's older brother. So there's going to be a kind of a new succession instead of father to son, as in the original dynasty, uncle to nephew. And Nersēs, at this moment in his history, considers Krikor from several angles. So first of all, he looks at their personal connection. He says, although I did not soar to the heights of my calling, but on the contrary was inclined to earth, leading us to think that he was not a total volunteer in the project to make himself into the clergyman, brought down by love of it, yet he, Krikor, did not decrease his good care for me. After the Creator, he created me again. After the one who cares for all, he cared for me. In other words, in Nersēs's view, his brother Krikor's role in his life is second only to that of God. Krikor is for him a second God. And this is a role that, of course, the church fathers felt that all parents play in the life of their children. the second God of their children. Furthermore, he says, Krikor resembled the Almighty in his creative power, specifically his power to recreate as a priest Nersess, who was not naturally drawn to the heights of his calling, but inclined instead towards worldly pursuits. In the Vipassana tune, Nersess also considers Krikor in the light of the divinely surprising circumstances that led him very early to assume the Catholicism. He says, from good roots, the Father, meaning God, caused a staff to blossom for us. I refer to my kinsman, whom I mentioned in my earlier words. His name was Grigor, chosen for his predecessor grandfather, using the term grandfather loosely. His father had at first received him. This is Bagaya says, entrusted him to his second father, that is Parsech, and he had trained him in sacred learning, instructing him as a youth with the Spirit's admonitions. And when his second father, Parsech, reached his end at death, he set him on his throne. And that's, of course, a quite dramatic story about how that actually happened. So, for Krikor, in Nersess's view, becoming Katolikos was manifest destiny. This was what he was born to do. And since the new Pahlavuni ecclesiastical dynasty did not pass from father to son physically, but from father to son spiritually, it was important to Nersess that Krikor was indeed his father according to the Spirit, by which I think he means more here than the simple fact that it was Krikor who ordained him, just how today we would use spiritual father. Interestingly, in the first line of this little section, Nersess has a biblical quote. He's quoting Isaiah 11:1. Which says, you have the Armenian there, I'll read the English. And a staff shall spring forth from Jesse's root, and from that root shall arise a flower. It's very nice, right? We admire Nersess's deft application of this verse, usually applied to Christ, to his brother. Christ as a lineal descendant of King David, the son of Jesse. So applying this image to Krikor makes it clear that for Nersess, Krikor is also Christ. Krikor is also, at the very least, Christ-like. He is the scion, the offshoot of a long lineage. So it's very nice to have him compared to David and Jesse and that. But there's more to this than meets the eye. Comparing Krikor to God or to Christ is not just a pretty figure of speech. It's not just there for the poetics of it. It's not just a simple generalization. Most people reading the epic would pick up on that reference. I think most people who are biblically literate would realize, oh, from a root there comes a staff. You go, okay, there we are. They would understand what Nersess implied in using it. But equally as important as the verse itself is what comes after it in the context of Isaiah 11, which might not occur to all readers. So if it doesn't occur to them, it's fine. They have a beautiful application. If it does occur to them, they will find this. Verses 2 to 9 of Isaiah 11 describe what spirit will rest upon the staff from Jesse and its blossom. Christ, by extension, Krikor. The verses say, I've left out some bits. Upon him, God's spirit will rest. A spirit of wisdom and understanding, spirit of counsel and might, a spirit of knowledge and piety, and A spirit of God's awe will fill him. He shall not judge on suspicion nor rebuke on hearsay. Instead, he will do right for the poor. Okay. And then, following that kind of list of spirit qualities, there's also a description of what will happen. Oops. Oh no, I lost a slide. Somewhere. Yes, I did. All right, you'll have to take my word for it. The description of what will happen during the reign of the Kavazan, of the staff of Christ, of Krikor, is this: a lion will graze like a lamb. A leopard will rest with a kid. A calf, an ox, and a lion will eat together. Very nice and idyllic. And then it adds, and the Lord will increasingly show his power to make enviable the remnants of his people that have remained from Syria, from Egypt, from the east, and from amongst the Arabs. So if we apply the context of Isaiah 11 to Krikor, as well as the actual verse that was cited, so if we take it a step farther, it implies that Krikor does not just have a general likeness to Christ, but that there are certain qualities, spiritual qualities, that he has in common with Christ and that he should also cultivate. A list that constitutes his actual qualifications for spiritual leadership, the spirit of wisdom, etc., resting on him. But there's also an expectation implied in the context, an expectation that God will use this fully qualified staff, Christ, Krikor, pastorally, in the literal sense of the word. He will use him to gather the scattered people, which certainly applied to Armenians in the time, around an ensign, or maybe within the safety of the fold, provided by the Pahlavuni house and its lineage. So what Nersess was saying about his brother in this historical / biographical epic went beyond the past. He's not just looking to legitimize Krikor in his heritage. He's not just looking at Krikor's nurturance by his first and second fathers, or even his accession to the see of his however many greats grandfather. Nersess is understanding his brother as part of a forward-looking vision. Krikor is an instrument. He is a staff. And we could do a nice word study on Kavazan and see how all of the uses of it in scripture add to our understanding of what that means. He would use Krikor as a tool for the reunification of the scattered Armenian people in the setting of a kind of idyllic peace where enemies would be reconciled. And the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord, like many waters that cover the sea. In other words, there has to be a high level of educational effort that also goes along with it. One more thing in this picture from the Viba sonnet tune. Nersess also says, this fulfilled the words of the meaning Krikor, fulfilled the words of the prophets. Sons shall take their father's place. He was seated as prince of the whole Armenian church, perfect, chosen by the Spirit's calling, filled with fruitful grace. He was given to us like Joshua in place of Moses, to be the cause of our salvation, making a nice pun on the meaning of Joshua's name. Elisha, inspired by having received double from Elijah. After the Savior ascended to the Father, he left the 11 on earth. After Paul had run the course, he granted us Timothy. So the compliments to Krikor are significant. The man is Elisha. The man is Joshua, who actually brought people into the promised land. He didn't have to stay outside, etc. He granted us Timothy, a second Zerubbabel. He gathered up those who were scattered. And the mother, rejoicing with her sons, this is a family references. He brought up to New Jerusalem, in other words, Kesun. He made arrangements for each, apportioning as fortune would have it. So he presents Krikor also as kind of the patriarch of the family, which makes one think he was probably the oldest. So we could look at each one of those biblical figures and unpack the obligation and expectation that's included in identifying Krikor with each of those. But for now, I want to just focus on the first line. This fulfilled the words of the prophets, sons shall take their father's place. Again, it's a self-evident statement. This is what happened. But Nersess specifically identifies it as a scripture reference. As the prophet says. It's important, in other words, that the reader not miss it. That the astute reader go beyond it. And presumably Krikor himself was among the earliest readers of this work. So once again, he's alerting us to the presence of a subtext, an extra text, a kind of complementary text that's provided by the context of the verse to which he is referring. He's referring to Psalm 44:17 in the Armenian numbering. And your sons will be in place of your fathers. You shall set them as princes throughout the whole land. That's great. In the context of the Vibasana tune, the verse is addressed to Krikor II and Parsech. It's in their place that their sons, Krikor and Nersess, Krikor in particular, have become princes. But the verse is not simply referring to the transfer of authority to the younger generation by the elder. The rest of the psalm says, I'm again taking excerpts, but you can read the whole thing. The king has desired your beauty. He himself is your Lord. You shall worship him. All the glory of the king's daughter is within. She is adorned and resplendent with garments hemmed in gold. Virgins following her shall lead her to the king. So the psalm, when you look a little deeper, is primarily about the king or the prince desiring the beauty of the king's daughter. And we know that the king's daughter, the bride, is a time-honored metaphor for the church. On the one hand, then, it is Krikor's job as a prince taking the place of his fathers to prepare her, to prepare the church, and adorn her to go to her husband Christ. And we recall also that husband is pervasive Old Testament image for God. It's also found in the parables of Jesus. So you have a completely different context being added here. It's not just that Krikor has received authority from his immediate predecessors. He has also received an obligation to prepare the church to meet Christ. And you could look at it from another point of view as well and say that it is Krikor, the church's current head, who has also loved the church's beauty. In other words, embedded in these lines of praise for his brother, there are deeper implied statements about Krikor's specific qualities and obligations as well. There are things included, unspoken, about his view of the church, his vision for where it was headed, his responsibilities to it. So even in his 20s, Nersess is showing signs of the techniques that are going to become a hallmark of his future writing. Words and sentences that mean one thing on the surface, perfectly good thing on the surface, but also have another deeper significance for those who have ears to hear, as it were. And the deeper meanings do not interrupt or disrupt the experience of a reader or a hearer who is simply enjoying the words at their more literal level. Okay, so that's something from the beginning of Nersess's career. I want to compare it with what Nersess said about Krikor much later in life. Although we don't know exactly when it was that Krikor commissioned Nersess to write a commentary on Matthew's gospel, the work was not finished by the time of Krikor's death in 1166, which probably means that we can assume the commission was given not too long before that. Maybe. And after Nersess's accession to the throne, it remained incomplete. So either Nersess didn't have time or he didn't have the heart to finish it without Krikor, who commissioned it. Kind of took the wind out of his sails, perhaps. Nersess never carried his commentary beyond Matthew 5:17, where Jesus says, I did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Now, fortunately, Nersess is not like us in yet another of the many ways he's not like us. When preparing this book of commentary, he began with what most of us would do last, the introduction. At the start of the introduction, he describes his motivation for writing this commentary and tells us what the essence of his relationship was with Krikor that prompted him to do this. He says, the power of love exceeds nature. And it is so great that it causes forgetfulness of a person's weakness, whether he's speaking of Krikor forgetting Nersess's weakness or Nersess forgetting his own. If love casts out the fear of death, as it is written, how much more does it scatter lesser adversaries for those who hold it fast? And if in the case of some, love is celebrated for physical causes, how much more for all those people such as myself, recipients of compassionate deeds from you, not only because of our natural blood relationship, which even for the thoughtless is a common cause for love, but because of the good things you have done for me that exceed spoken or written word, in return for which you have received from us no worthy repayment of visible perishable things, except perchance the completion of this commission and the things consequent to it that occasion eternal good. Having written that, I think Nersess must have felt a little guilty for never finishing this. O Katoigos of Armenia Grigoris, after the head of the church, Christ, its honorable head, my weakness of understanding is strengthened by love for this project. So everything about this commentary comes from Krikor. It's inspired by him. Nersess forgets the weakness that he would otherwise feel acutely before writing something like this. And so here we're going out a little bit on one of my favorite limbs. In the remainder of the introduction, I think, Nersess makes a concerted effort, a loving effort, to reflect Krikor's pastoral concerns, why he wanted this thing to be written, particularly his pastoral concern for how teachers should be teaching. The people who were using this commentary would be teachers. How they should be teaching in order to meet the theological and spiritual needs of their students, who in turn would go out to meet the theological and spiritual needs of communities. And how to do this in a manner that was harmonious, consonant with the church's faith, not simply their own opinions, educated though those might be. So because this commentary was commissioned by Krikor, I would find it very hard to believe that Nersess used it as a vehicle for anything with which his brother would have disagreed or which his brother would have found irrelevant for the purpose. Again, they were hamashunch, we've been told. So with some caution, I just want to poke around a little bit in the introduction to Nersess's commentary on Matthew and see what we can discern about Krikor's motivations and thoughts reflected there. Obviously, this is not even going to be the first word on Krikor's theology, let alone anything more than that, but I do want us to push the boundaries for a few minutes and see what we might find. And what we find are quandaries that a student would quite possibly wrestle with and bring to class, issues that a teacher or even a Catholicos might actually have, things that they would wrestle with as well. Simple but profound questions. For example, Why are the four Gospels not in agreement with one another? This is not an outdated question. You can ask AI on Google. It will point you to many writers and websites with opinions on this question. Some of them content by people who call themselves things like Diogenes the critic, or some such way to get out of taking responsibility for what they're about to say. So there's this question, why are they not in agreement? There's also some variants that grow out of that. Why four Gospels? Why these four Gospels? In other words, the person who's bringing the question already knows that there was a range of Gospel options that didn't make the canonical cut. So this is not an unintelligent or uneducated audience. Why are only two of the four Gospel writers apostles? In other words, why are non-eyewitness accounts also accepted into the final number? The response of Nersēs, and thus I think by extension, Grigor's response, are rather different from our own. We might be tempted to explain that actually the four Gospels are not at variance with one another. They can and should be harmonized. That's a common answer. We might think of explaining more or less scientifically that it would be unreasonable and even psychologically unsound to expect four people to see the same person or event in the same way. We might point to the Diatessaron. See, they do harmonize. Nersēs doesn't do any of that. Instead, he reframes the question. His response to the question of why the four Gospels are not in agreement is another question. How would it have affected us if they had been all in agreement? Mm. We respond that, meaning their disagreement, is a great sign of the truth of what they say, because if they had written everything equally, none of their enemies would have believed that they wrote in different places and times. They would have said that they got together in some location, made an agreement, and wrote what they wanted. But their minor discrepancies, so-called, free them from such suspicions. And here we go back to Professor Marco Baez's presentation. They maintain their unison unshaken in the larger things. That he was God, became man, worked miracles, was crucified, buried, and rose and ascended into heaven and is going to come again to judge the earth. That's what matters. Everybody shares it. Don't be disturbed that from among the miracles or the teachings, one wrote this, another one wrote that. For if one of them had said it all, the accounts of the rest would have been superfluous. Okay, just 2 seconds for the next question. Why are there only four? Of course, there are only four. Mm-hmm. The elemental functions of the Gospels demanded that they be four, not three, not five. The divine, it was widely understood, reveals itself in patterns, often though not exclusively, mathematical or geometric patterns. The essential building blocks of life in the universe, the elements that in various combinations create the bodies of things, are defined as four. So also the elemental source of life, water, is distributed along four main pathways according to Genesis. Long before Christ became incarnate, long before the evangelists existed to tell about him, in other words, Nersēs is saying the principle of fourness as the foundation of nourishment of life is set in place. And he describes the four rivers. Since there were only these four, no more and no less, four Gospels, we ought to recognize that this too was depicted beforehand by the Spirit through metaphors. First, the four rivers from Eden, as the latter irrigate and cool the universe from the warmth of heat, in the same way the evangelists, through the outpouring of the Spirit and the water of the font, extinguish the flame of sin that was ignited by Eve throughout the four corners of the world. And they made the city of God, which incidentally is a city foursquare, the church, which had been given to us in place of paradise, rejoices in the streams of the rivers. He then goes on to draw on Philo without attribution So he may have assumed that his readers were familiar. In order to transfer the idea of the rivers whose waters nourish the earth physically to the idea of the four cardinal virtues that nourish the soul and make it fruitful. And we're not going to read this. You can read it either on the slide or in Philo. But he makes this parallel between virtue, the water of life, the elements of life, the functions of life. So in short, it seems that what Krikor wanted from Nersēs was a way to present pedagogically the idea that the four Gospels differ from one another, not only because they would be less cogent and less believable if they didn't differ, but because they make the soul fruitful. They differ because each Gospel nourishes a particular fundamental life-enhancing virtue. And Nersēs gives him that pedagogical explanation, that pedagogical tool, even before he gets into the body of the commentary on Matthew proper. So in conclusion, while we do not, as far as I know, have sources that bear directly on Krikor's theology other than his hymns, I do think it's possible to at least tentatively understand his theological mind, his aims, his approaches through Nersess's offering to his brother of methods to realize his own theological mind in the minds of others, which is what every teacher wants to do. Krikor's presence in Nersess's writings is quiet, but it may be powerful nonetheless. Thank you.
Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. It's hard to believe we're at the very end of this conference with our final closing keynote address. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to introduce my own doctoral advisor, Professor Peter Cowe, who is the Naragatsu Professor of Armenian Studies at UCLA and has also taught in the past at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, University of Chicago, Columbia University, and while he was at Columbia, also taught some classes here at St. Nersess Seminary when it was in New Rochelle. His research interests include, among many other areas, Armenian history, modern Armenian nationalism, Armenian film and theater, about all of which topics he has either written or edited or translated books, the author of 5 books and editor of 4, and a regular contributor to Armenological and other theological, early Christian, medieval journals. And very interesting, I didn't know this until I saw here, received a grant from the National Council on Eurasian and East European Research recently to investigate the post-Soviet publishing industry in the Republic of Armenia. But we're going back 800 years from that time. And while we've spent most of our time naturally talking about Nersēs Shnorhali in Cilicia, with some kind of interludes to the northeast and Hakhpat through Professor Laporta and Bishop Daniel's talks, here we're really moving northeast with this closing keynote address, which will be on Nersēs Shnorhali's contemporary Mkhitar Ghosh and his connection with the Georgian Church. Professor Cowe?
Yes. So thank you very much to Jesse for your introduction. As others have done, I think it's very, very appropriate to begin by thanking the organizers, Professor Irvine and Dr. Shane Yan, for their invitation to participate in this conference, which is well timed overall in terms of the calendar, to draw together some of the broader issues relating to Shnorhali Yev Barakayur. And so I commend you both, Vaskardit Gadar, for all the labor, OUR and labor, in bringing this to fruition. As the last speaker, I can truly say that it's been a real intellectual and spiritual feast. exploring so many aspects of the medieval hierarch and his world that has enriched our understanding of his ministry and artistry, as well as the milieu in which he fulfilled his mission. As an old St. Nersēs affiliate, as was indicated, it's been a real pleasure for me to visit the new campus and to discover so many old friends here and meet many new after so many years. I think I speak for all of us in thanking both organizers and members of the new community for all your gracious and considerate hospitality, which has permitted those of us who were able to be present in person to extend our discussions over further table fellowship in spaces on and off campus. Looking ahead, we also wish you a light load, Tetev Ber, in your plans for editing the conference papers and for the publication in due course. Obviously, we link the name of Mr. Ghosh more directly with his judicial manual to give judges the opportunity better to determine the punishment most fitting for the various crimes on which they had to pronounce sentence, dadastan, on the basis of biblical, customary law, and canon law precedent, as well as his more popular fables that transmit so much pertinent wisdom through the means of apt, concise, easily memorable micro-narratives. A little more attention has been generated by his commentary on the prophecy of Jeremiah, which was probably based on a series of lectures he gave on the subject to his pupils at Nor Gedi Monastery as part of a wider scholarly activity, expanding with the new structures of Cenobitic monasticism in Armenia from the 10th century. Much less familiar is his exchange with the Georgians that can be dated to the last years of his life at the beginning of the 13th century. The historian Gyargos Gansagetsi is familiar with the work, which Ghosh composed at the request of the Armenian aristocratic brothers Zakare and Ivane Yerganapazug, whose name has been mentioned earlier on today. As Ghosh states, a particular stimulus to write emanated from the brothers' apparent appreciation of anti-Armenian statements made at a public forum, which determined him to respond. These occurred at a period of increased tension between Armenian and Georgian Christians that had resulted in both parties' rebaptism of converts. The latter was obviously a matter of concern for the sovereigns, Queen Tamar and her consort David Soslan, who are appropriately referred to twice in the document as, I quote, our victorious kings. Presumably, they looked to their high Armenian functionaries for concrete solutions to the problem, and they in turn approached their spiritual father, Ghosh, gone too far, to benefit from his judicious advice at this crucial juncture. It appears that the writing was produced between the Synod of Loreb, 1245, and that of Ani, 1207, and so most probably was penned in 1206. Fundamentally, it appears as the rebuttal of an anti-Armenian treatise in 30 chapters included in the major Georgian translation of Greek, Latin, and Arab fathers known as the Dogmatikoni by Arsen Ikaltoeli, died circa 1127. Although the above treatise had been attributed to John of Damascus, it has since been identified as by the scholar Evstratius of Nicaea, died circa 1120. A few years after Ghosh's writing, Evstratius' work was translated into Armenian, probably by the well-known Armenian Chalcedonian monk Simeon Brintzahanetsi, to which the translator appended a much longer apologia for Chalcedonianism in Armenia, transmitted in the manuscripts together with Evstratius' text. However, it appears that Gosh had availed himself of the Georgian version, contesting various aspects of the Armenian creed and church regulations, Gark. The Georgian schism of the early 7th century resulted in their involvement in religious contention against their former co-religionists, with the participation of figures like Arsen Sapareli, armed with the Georgian translation of the 7th century Armenian Chalcedonian text, Narratio de Rebus Armeniae. These debates obviously increased with the unification of the Georgian lands in the 11th century and the creation of a strong Georgian monarchy under David the Builder, again, has been mentioned today, David Ahmashenebeli, now participating in the early medieval model of theological duels between controversialists, as that of Sosiris of Marmashen and Eftime Gurzeli of Jerusalem, with which we can compare Theodore Abukura's contestation against Nana the Syrian in the 9th century and the 10th century Armenian theologians contending in Constantinople, which presumably served as a stimulus for the evolving mystique of Nersēs Shnorhali and David the Invincible, who provided precedents and models for this later professionalized type of encounter. More focused debate on Armeno-Georgian issues provides a backdrop for Anania Sanakhnetzi's apology in the 11th century, which contains a section on the separation of the Georgians that Gosh cites in extenso. Clearly, this latter factor gained in emphasis with Georgian hegemony over most of Armenian territory in the 1120s, together with the predominant artisan and merchant population of Tbilisi and new foundations established for Armenians by the Georgians, such as Gori. The current interaction that engaged Gosh's attention occurred near the end of that heyday, as the Georgian kingdom, in turn, was to fall victim to Mongol invasion and annexation within the next 2 decades. Rather than leading you through a detailed discussion of the minutiae of the doctrinal and liturgical matters involved, most of which were already hardy annuals of the controversialist literature over several centuries and were broached by other speakers on Thursday. For example, the addition to the Tersion, the celebration of the Nativity on January 6th, the theological implications of animal sacrifice in Armenian liturgics, etc. I would like to use Gosh's work as a springboard for an investigation of some of the substructural elements and presuppositions of inter-ecclesial dialogue that tend to remain below our radar and out of consideration as this process has continued up to our own day within the context of the ecumenical movement. What are some of the general lessons to be gleaned from a study in longue durée of discussions between Chalcedonians and Armenians, or in common parlance, between the Eastern Orthodox and ancient Oriental communions? Clearly, to conceptualize the discussion, the latter employs modern categories to identify and distinguish the two groups of churches. Here I would like us to bear in mind that neat clusterings both illuminate and obfuscate in such cases. In this context, it has become accepted to differentiate the Chalcedonian communities as Eastern Orthodox, while the other smaller group is styled Ancient Oriental. Apart from the Armenians, the grouping comprises the Syrian, Coptic, and Ethiopian churches and Church of South India. This approach also undergirds several scholarly treatments of the subject by Adrian Fortescue, Aziz Atiyah, and others, as well as various fora like the World Council of Churches and joint discussions in the contemporary period with the Roman Catholic Church, etc. The question then arises as to how appropriate that terminology is of grouping the Armenians together with the other 4 non-Chalcedonian churches founded in late antiquity? And to what degree does it impact our understanding of how the Armenian Church functioned in late antiquity and the Middle Ages? What then do these churches hold in common? Primarily, it is this one negative feature of opposition to the Chalcedonian Christological formula, whereas in most other spheres, they manifest significant idiosyncrasies among themselves. It may be convenient to consolidate them together in this way, but is it appropriate? Significantly, in his discourse, although Ghosh refers several times to the Syrians in discussions of the different churches of his time, he only refers to a closer relationship between the Armenians and the Syrians with regard to, again, one of the presentations today, in celebrating the feast day of Sarkis and his son Mardiros in his treatment of the Arachavorats fast. This, he states, is unfamiliar to his Georgian interlocutors since it derives from Syriac sources and is not available in Greek. Thus, it is clear that he views the Syrians as a separate tradition with no organic ties apart from their common origins in the early church. Moreover, he barely mentions the Copts and Ethiopians. In this connection, it is important to observe the contrast with the Eastern Orthodox clustering, which truly represents fundamentally one ecclesial communion with one doctrine, liturgics, baptism and communion, canon law, etc. As a result, Ghosh's interplay between the Georgians and Armenians gains significance, as the former is the main representative of Eastern Orthodoxy in Southern Caucasia. This phenomenon is perfectly clear to our author, who argues that Armenians' northern neighbors have acquired much of their perspective and understanding from the Greeks, i.e. the Byzantine Church, and at certain key points to which we will return, where he talks about the four contemporary branches of Christianity that for him possess a serious basis to be styled the church overall. The Georgians are not mentioned in this connection since they are obviously satellites subsumed under the Greek rubric. Since their entry into Byzantine communion, as already substantiated by the example of Arsen's Dogmatikoni, Georgian theology and liturgics relinquished some of their autonomy and agency and largely followed Byzantine precedent, their primary intellectual focus being to render those core Greek texts with ever more accurate literal renderings, as we note particularly in this period in the activities of the Athenites Georgi and Eftime, Eprem Mitsiri of the Black Mountain, and Ioanne Petrizzi of Gelati. What then of the Armenian Church? It consequently possesses a distinctive historical development that has resulted in a wide range of distinctive features. Being autocephalous, it had to plot its own path of Christian development without the onus of conforming to any larger structure in determining doctrine and canon law, which of necessity granted it enormous latitude. Armenians distinguished themselves also typologically in certain respects from Syrians and Copts, who at Ghosh's time represent ecclesial polities or confessions, whose main identity factor is their creed and religious observance. Egypt had been annexed by Alexander's empire, while the Syrian state of Osroene was assimilated into the Roman Empire in the 2nd century CE. In contrast, Armenians maintained a parallel secular identity as subjects of a lay aristocracy within a state structure that featured an imaginary extending over periods of interregnum into the 18th, 19th century for the renewal of that kingdom, one that in the contemporary period under Levon I in Cilicia was currently thriving. Another major difference, this time with most of the churches that we have discussed so far, was the important consideration that after the first generation of its inception, the Armenian church developed outside the Roman Empire, first under direct Persian suzerainty, and then indirectly during the Caliphate, and hence evolved within a very different environment with different concepts, norms, and institutions. In this regard, it possesses certain affinities with the Church of the East. But whereas rejected by the West, the latter identified with its Persian ambience and directed its expansion eastward towards India and China, the Armenians reached a modus vivendi with the Persians while seeking increasing affiliation with Rome. However, since it was no longer possible to occupy the status of a civitas foederata, or client kingdom, Armenians determined that it was preferable to remain formally outside Roman authority and were therefore constrained to create a parallel narrative ecclesiastically to convey their separate status in terms comprehensible to a Roman audience. Nevertheless, while it is accepted to consider these issues primarily in terms of political history, it is less common to reflect on their impact on ecclesiastical affairs. However, it is important to view this holistically and not to exclude the ecclesiastical from wider society. One of my main arguments will therefore be precisely that in order to understand the Chalcedonian interchange with the Armenian Church, it is crucial to contextualize these identities within the socio-political structure in which they functioned in the translation from the late Roman Empire into the Byzantine period. Clearly, one of the most important questions that preoccupied the Georgians in discussion with Ghosh is a typically Roman concept of conciliarity, the convening and significance of an ecumenical council, which patently encompasses the importance then of Chalcedon and the 13th century goal of settling disputes between the Georgians and Armenians, as well as the positioning of the question in our time that Armenians should defend themselves for departing from the conciliar norms and embracing monophysitism. This is to significantly misconstrue the Armenian role in Dvin under a Persian Vostigan governor, where the important rationale for assembling the Second Synod there in the 550s was to treat the proselytism of Syrophone Persian Nestorians in the Armenian capital, and where the full Armenian anti-Chalcedonian expression came in response to the Georgian schism in 607. The Armenian focus was internal and Eastern, and its reaction to Chalcedon was mediated. In the Persian realm, the Armenians lacked direct agents in the proceedings, like the Egyptian Dioscorus and the Syrian Severus, and were visited by the Julianist Syrian Simeon of Beit al-Sham because of the lack of hierarchs to ordain clergy in the Roman sphere. More broadly, Armenians lacked a doctrine of the ongoing functionality of ecumenical councils and conciliarity, since the latter only applied to the Roman Empire, and Armenian representation occurred only at the very first council under St. Gregory's son, Aristarchus. Similarly, the structuring of an Armenian set of synods composed by Hophanes Otsnetsi, which Ghosh cites in detail, should be interpreted as a formal symbolic creation to respond to Roman queries in a format that they would comprehend, not a historical reality. Likewise, the Armenian acceptance of the first three councils was subsequent in light of contact by Roman confederates, whereas in Byzantium, conciliarity was a direct legacy from Rome and a living aspect of their theology and canon law. In consequence, Ghosh refers tangentially to the Seventh Council on Defense of Religious Art in his note that Greeks and Georgians, i.e. the Byzantine Communion, venerates images more highly, where the Armenians are more devoted to the cross. Clearly, since Armenians had not experienced the topsy-turvy of complete rejection of religious art under iconoclasm and the rejoinder of the Middle Byzantine model of covering the entirety of a shrine in images, the Armenian approach represented balance and continuity with the status quo ante. As a result, in the next section, I'd like to demonstrate that the ecclesiology of the Byzantine Communion and the Armenian Church represent two fundamentally antithetical paradigms, and that in this nexus, the religious facet importantly reflects the socio-political structure that incorporates it. The resulting antitheses can be tabulated as follows. Where the first term defines the Byzantines, the second the Armenians. Hegemonic versus non-hegemonic. Centralized versus devolved. Militarily expansionist, and therefore regularly taking the initiative to engage in polemics, versus militarily defensive to maintain the status quo, and never initiating religious polemics, but responding to attack by appeal to apologetics in search of peaceful coexistence. Imperial independence politically and absolute identification with the universal church religiously versus politically pursuing autonomy within an overarching imperial structure with a relative understanding ecclesially, recognizing inclusion within a wider plenum, and therefore appreciating the need for mutual recognition and rejection of exclusionist reactions to the other, such as rebaptism. That the Roman Empire was hegemonic is clear from its goal of continual expansion. Moreover, reduced in the post-Justinian era, the memory of a state embracing the whole Mediterranean littoral persisted as a constant goad to its reattainment. Religiously, this status was important, considering the emperor's role as head of the church and God's representative on earth, manifesting itself in the aspiration to extend missions and export controversialists to facilitate conversion to orthodoxy as a means of drawing ever more communities into the imperial sphere. The resultant triumphalism is embedded in hymns like the Troparion to the Cross, which continues the line, I quote, "Grant victories to the Orthodox Christians over their adversaries, and by virtue of your cross, preserve your habitation," unquote. In contrast to Armenian hymns on the cross, where the victory is singularly over sin and Satan. The marriage of church and state, already inchoate under Theodosius I, became a fuller reality in the 7th century, where the majority of the adult population was baptized, while the diversity of the southern and eastern littoral of the Mediterranean was removed by the Islamic invasions. As a result, the empire emerged as one polity, one religious communion, one language, one city, with a very centripetal focus, where from the time of Heraclius and Khusrau II, automatically, external conflicts might easily be designated as a holy war. As the heir of Roman law, its perspective of the status of ecumenical councils was incontrovertible and legally binding as an absolute means of determining the truth in doctrinal matters, representing the norm that had been affirmed by all, everywhere, at all times, thereby identifying with the universal church. It is therefore it represented a standard higher than that of human opinion, and as such could not be altered or restructured. In this regard, it is patent that doctrines like monothelitism and monoergism, introduced under imperial duress, had little staying power over the course of doctrinal development. It follows from this that the conclusion of any Byzantine and by extension Eastern Orthodox theological discussion would be the renunciation of all divergent jurisdictional, doctrinal, and liturgical elements with due repentance as heretical in preparation for reception into the Byzantine communion as the Catholic and Apostolic Church. Confidence in this theological structure underscored the ampardabarutun, the haughtiness or exceptionalism with which Gosh characterized the Greeks from a pre-modern psychological perspective. Hence, it is important to grasp the substructure that supported this internal reaction, which was not itself the issue at stake to be transformed by moral rigor, but a byproduct of the system that underlies it, that could only be circumvented by radical wholesale reformulation of the Church's constitution. This is why none of the theological discussions with Byzantium or the Eastern Orthodox Communion has ever reached a different conclusion, regardless of date, arena, or the personalities involved. A good example is the Armenian region of Daron, which accepted this type of Byzantinization in the 940s. These strictures also pertained to aspects of liturgical variation, since many of those practices had generated symbolic associations with related doctrines, which therefore now endowed them with greater theological weight. Gosh compares the current ecclesiastical debates with those of pagan philosophical schools, like the Peripatetics and Cynics, which possess certain legitimate parallels, which, however, pale into insignificance when we recall the context of ecclesiastical councils supported by the military arm of the state. Turning to the Armenian case, we observe its significant disjunction. As a non-hegemonic polity, its goals are to achieve local autonomy, in consequence of which it is not intent on conquest and hence maintains Irenic external policies, accepting a foreign suzerain, often of a different religious background, provided he grant them administrative and creedal discretion. In this way, Armenians subsisted with religious plurality and confessional diversity for many centuries under the rule of Sasanians, Arabs, Seljuks, Mongols, later Muslim Kurds, Safavids, etc., with their aristocratic dynasties on the land, affording the community's core cohesion to anchor the wider population. Moreover, as that aristocracy was fractious and divided in its loyalties, which we talked about today, Gosh states that in religious matters also, Armenians do not follow their hierarchs, as witnessed by several examples of insubordination on the part of the sees of Sunnic and Caucasian Albania, and of course we could add those that we discussed earlier on this morning, among other indicators, challenging the primacy of the Armenian Catholicate, in part because of a lack of a parallel defined legal tradition comparable to Rome. Similarly, the Armenians did not seek to extend their ecclesiastical jurisdiction over others. Hence, their application of a parallel jurisdiction to co-religionists in Byzantine regions around Sebastia and Melitene should not be perceived as a démarche against the local Byzantine hierarchies, but rather providing pastoral care to the growing Armenian communities in those provinces as a result of Byzantine calls for repopulation by Christians after advancing the border into caliphal territory. On the contrary, countless correspondence reveals the Armenian attempt to maintain cordial relations with Byzantium in both the political and religious spheres, without at the same time incurring the rejection of their distinctive traits or their wholesale annexation by Byzantine institutions. In consequence, from the time of Heraclius to Photius and the Synod of Shiragavan in the 9th century, and the exchanges of Anania Naragatsi and Samvel Gamerchatsoretsi in the 10th, Anania Sanachnetsi and Bedros Gedetarts in the 11th, Hophanes Sarkavag, Nersēs Shnorhali and Boros Daronatsi in the 12th, and beyond our author Mikhail Ghosh in the 13th, Armenians never took the initiative in polemics, but sought to maintain cordial coexistence instead, inserting various correctives of unacceptable creedal issues and liturgical practice on the part of their interlocutors in the course of their apologetic responses. Recognizing their polity definitely belonged within the broader plenum of the Universal Church. They recognized other communions as joining them in that enterprise. Hence, Ghosh, with his Armenian relative perspective, appeals to four. So in addition to the Armenians, the Latins, Byzantines, subsuming other churches like the Georgians, and the Syrians, as representing the key components of that continuum, clearly stating that all, inclusive of the Armenians, are imperfect and unworthy in various domains, but that their fundamental doctrinal and liturgical compatibility should serve as a basis for respectful coexistence in Christian love, rather than traducing and calumniating each other, thereby bringing the name of Christ, their master, into disrepute. However, as I have tried to demonstrate, even this modest goal was elusive because of the fundamental incompatibility of the divergent principles of ecclesiology that the churches employed, which in turn owed much to the interchange with the political structure of the societies those churches indwelt. Not fully comprehended by the actors in the generations outlined above, those principles would continue to determine the impracticability of their joint projects at both political and religious levels throughout the pre-modern period, and appear set to continue to determine such eventualities in the ongoing discussions between those communions at the present time. Thank you.
Once again, thank you very much, Professor Peter Cowe, Professor Abraham Tarian, for being here in person. This is really a huge commitment out of your schedule, out of your very busy end of term calendar. So I just want to deeply thank you on behalf of Dr. Irvin and I. It's just been a pleasure, and really it's such not only an illumination of the mind, the heart, but really just bringing us in one vision together to bring our various ideas around this table. And indeed, I do hope that there would be another visitation around this table together. Also hoping that all of our very beautiful and lovely colleagues from Armenia and Europe will also be with us. Thank you very much.
And from the West.
And oh yes, yes, yeah, and from the West.
It is a different world out there, so.